When I was in the 8th grade, I faced the greatest difficulty of my childhood. My parents separated. On a Sunday morning, my dad told me and my brother that he was moving out, and that afternoon, he moved out. I'm not sure if I've cried as much before or after that day. I was totally devastated. The next morning, I got up to go to school, and I was an 8th grader, and those middle school years weren't the best years anyway, but I really did not want to go to school that day. I walked to school, and I remember trudging across a church parking lot on my way to school. And God spoke to me in that parking lot. I can't tell you what God's voice sounded like. I've only maybe had once or twice since then where I thought I heard God's voice. But I knew in that moment that it was God's voice telling me, I am with you. And through this, you'll get to know me better. Even as I say those words now, I'm still utterly convinced some 30 plus years later that it was God speaking. God spoke to me. And those words of God were a tremendous comfort to me then, and they still are today. One of the things that followers of Jesus talk about is having a relationship with Jesus. We say that Jesus wants to have a relationship with us, which leads to a really great question. What does it mean to have a relationship with Jesus? I'm serious about that question. I can't fully answer that question today, and I don't intend to, but since Jesus is not physically present with us any longer, that means that somehow a relationship with Jesus happens inside of us. A relationship with Jesus is an interior relationship. Paul, an early follower of Jesus and a missionary for Jesus, wrote about Christ in us. Christ in us. What does that mean? Today we are continuing in our series, Noticing God, by talking about the interior relationship we have with God and the communication from God that can happen in that relationship. Throughout this series, based on the book Noticing God by Richard Peace, we've acknowledged that it's one thing to believe in God, but it's something else entirely to encounter God's presence. God is present in our lives and in our world, but we're all too often not very good noticers. So we're going to be challenged again today to grow in the spiritual practice of noticing God. We're doing this to move beyond knowing about God to actually knowing God. And we get there by noticing. Now, the noticing God that we'll focus on today is recognizing God's still, small voice. Now, maybe you've heard that phrase before. Maybe you haven't. I put it in quotes when it's on the screen because it is a quote, and it comes from the Old Testament, and that phrase is found in a story about a prophet named Elijah. Listen to this encounter with God that Elijah had. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" There's a lot of context for this passage that I won't get into today because I want to highlight and focus in on that experience that is described here that Elijah has with God. It's an experience that is filled with mystical power, the wind, the earthquake, the fire. And it's an interior experience of a still, small voice. Now, was it an audible voice? Could other people hear it? I don't know. The text isn't clear. But somehow what Elijah heard had to be processed in his mind, whether it was an audible, still small voice or an internal, still small voice. These two very different experiences of wind, earthquake, and fire, and of a still small voice of God, are somehow integrated in this story. Now, what's interesting about the phrase still small voice is that it comes from a difficult Hebrew phrase to translate. I won't read that phrase for you because it's not that memorable of a phrase. The Revised Standard Version, which is what I just quoted, uses still small voice as the translation. The New Revised Standard Version uses this, a sound of sheer silence. That's an interesting way to put it, isn't it? The New International Version translates the Hebrew phrase as a gentle whisper. And the New English Bible translates the Hebrew as a low murmuring sound. Elijah's experience is dramatic, and it points to the challenge of pinning down God's voice. One of the practices that we've introduced in this Noticing God series is to use your imagination to notice God. As I've been talking about Elijah's experience, you've probably been using your imagination to imagine this story. So let's pause for a short chat question here about imagination. Take a moment to imagine to yourself that you are in this story of Elijah. What do you notice? Let's take a moment and talk about that.